Thank you for tuning in to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 136. Questions to ask yourself before you start world building, part 2, or as Jeff would call it, questions you ask yourself as you begin world building.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
And we're here today to talk about world building.
Hey, that's a novel idea.
You know, I should have thought about this like 135 episodes ago.
I think you did think about this 135 episodes ago.
That is the point of the show, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So what have you got for us today?
Okay, so this is a quick recap. We started going over some basic questions about geography and the cosmos of where your world exists. And
I feel like last episode we kind of meandered around the conversation a bit. I feel like we didn't have a whole lot of really strict questions.
There wasn't with that. Here, there's a lot more specific questions.
We got some more, what's the word I'm looking for? Format, structure, a little more structure.
A little more structure to this episode because now we're starting to get into, this is what I like to call creating a starting world inventory. It's sort of the basic concepts that you want to use to start your world. And so let's get started, and I'll try and pretend like I can read my handwriting because it's all brilliant stuff.
You know that you always say that whenever we can't read your handwriting, right? Which is most of the
whenever
time.
I use a pen or pencil.
Yeah, pretty much.
This is what happens when I write down notes instead of type down notes. Okay, so the first question you have to ask yourself, are there any religions, languages, races, cultures, states,
the first question. Like, the first question is, do you have any of the following?
Well, yeah, but that's really what it is. It's like, 'cause sometimes you have these ideas that sit out there already that you want to incorporate into a world.
So you have,
so you're trying to get an inventory. That's really the whole point of this, is to get an inventory of what type of.
What have you got so far? So what do you need to tie together? Like, I got a character who's religious and he has a profession, and there's a supernatural aspect to the world. So that's only 3 components. What else do I need?
Exactly. And that was faces, which was the word I was having trouble reading. So thank you.
Gotcha.
And when I use the word faces, if you remember back to the earlier episode, I'm talking about NPCs or characters in your novel world. So I just like that because it rhymes better.
Faces?
Yeah.
Ooh, from rhymes with what?
Like basics.
Oh, gotcha.
Races,
faces.
Yeah. Very, very clever.
Very clever.
It's a haiku.
I'm not giving you a point yet.
Not that clever.
Not that clever.
Okay.
You're close. I'll admit you're close. You're about the 65% there.
So the idea was, when I was developing Gardul, I had done it after years of sort of creating stuff for specific other worlds or other things that I was doing. So I wanted a world to tie them all in together in. So like I have several races, cultures, states. We've talked about a few of them on the show in the past. But there are actually way more than any human should probably have in a world. Especially if you want to do it right. But the thing is, for most of them, I know bare basic details. For some of them, I know a lot. But the idea is, whenever I have these things, I like to write them down. So if there's a specific religion I wanted to incorporate into a world, but I didn't really have a culture behind it. If I wanted, if I had a language in mind, which for me isn't natural to start that way. But for other people who have a linguistic background, like Tolkien, his world was inspired by languages he was creating. So get an idea of what you know, even if it's just a few basic ideas. I like to have at least 3 bullet points, sort of 3 descriptors for each thing at a minimum, just so I can remember the heart of it, because that'll typically give you enough to remember the heart of it. And if you have a little bit more, you can write it down now too. But
What I think is neat about the way your world has developed, and it may not have been on purpose. I know part of it. What I'm about to say, though, I think it became purposeful at a point where your world is set up in a fashion where not only sociologically but also geographically, you have room to either create something that you haven't created yet, or you can add something like. If there isn't a spot for it, you can easily make a spot for it because the geography allows for change.
Yeah. It's like I sort of have stuff that covers the basic terrain in my mind, but it's not the real story.
It's probably more appropriate to say train wreck if it's in your mind.
Yes, it's definitely a train wreck. But the idea is like I have basic cultures and ergo states that develop from the cultures that sort of cover the geography of the world in general. But the thing you have to remember is, in reality, where cultures collide, where states collide, a lot of times new cultures, new states can actually rise up out of those. That's a culture early on spreads out really far. It'll have a similar belief structure. And then in different areas, you'll see it sort of grow into its own thing, unless they have the ability to keep informing each other with the experiences that they have in all of the different parts of the world. On Earth, if you look like the Indo-European peoples, you say, wow, that name sort of covers a lot. And it's a prototype culture is what we call it. But you see Indo-European peoples all the way from Western Europe, all the way to Southern Asia, and probably even beyond a little bit, where similar sounds, similar gods. I mean, like there was originally a thunder god near India. And I wonder where he made it to. Probably a little more famous up north with the Vikings. So you figure the basic belief structure spread out, but then over time and due to isolation, they grew into these independent cultures, and some of which you could put right next to each other today and be like, I have no idea. Or then you take a weirder culture like Finnish, which isn't really an Indo-European culture, and they would appear more like the peoples around them who are Indo-European than the other culture groups that they're related to on Earth.
I mean, the basic gist that I think you're trying to pin down is that when you've got that many people, that many cultures that are spread out across land, even if it's like a game of telephone, even if it was just even if it started with, say, 10,000 people that were identical, they all believed in the same thing, they all farmed the same way and whatever, but they slowly had to expand as they move throughout the land, as they come to different geographies and develop different skills and subsequently start believing new things just because of the things they see around them. It's going to evolve. They're going to change. So you cover that amount of space, you're going to have, even if they all started out the same, and they never do, you're going to end up with things that are very different.
And it's very odd. Due to weather patterns, it can be very impactful. So you have this Andean area, basically.
Andean?
Like the
South America. Like the Andes Mountains? Is that what you're talking about?
Andes Mountains, essentially to the west, is kind of what we consider the Andean cultures.
Okay.
And the Incas are probably the ones people know the most. And
Incas?
And
the Incas.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
The lines are down there, all kinds of neat stuff, especially in Peru and all along that coast. But due to a couple specific things, you have this very cold water that comes up the coast, which creates this desert along a large part of it because the water's cold, the air's cold above, not a lot of moisture reaches the area. So in one spot, it's very dry. And then occasionally El Nino happens, something we've all become familiar with in the United States recently. At least for me, I've only heard about for the last 10 years.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I feel like we got, what did we get? Like one of them about,
every 10 or 20 years. And occasionally there are really powerful ones. And this last one, I think, was supposed to be more powerful.
I don't think I had ever heard of that until like about 10 years ago. As a child, I'd never heard of it. And we'd had hurricanes and
other things. And like we learn these new things all the time. But what happens is when that weather pattern affects us up here, it also pushes warm water further south, which changes the way fish flow, which dries up the fish in the water because the fish that are there are normally cold water fish. So new fish appear, old fish go away. And what you'd see is that the native cultures in the area would sort of, because of the harsh weather they would get with a lot of rains in that time, would typically push back up into the mountains. And learn and become affected in different ways. So over centuries, several cultures developed in the area. They were related, but each time, every 500 years or so, like a distinctive new culture would sort of appear out of the same people just because of the cycle of El Niños, and whole areas would become deserted, and then you see these new towns pop up inland, and then over time, the coastal would become more important again. So it would be the shift back and forth, even in a small geographical area in the scope of the world. Still over centuries develops new cultures. So you can really go crazy with cultures if you want to.
You know what? We should splinter, and by we I mean probably you, should splinter a second podcast. Like you should have a history podcast because you get so into it, and we'll ask a question on this show, and I always think that it adds a lot to it, but I feel like sometimes you go so far on a tangent, I have to circle us back to where we started. Mm-hmm. But you're so into it. Like we should totally do maybe just like a history show where we pick an area. Mm-hmm. I'll ask an ignorant question about that area, and then you can just explain it. But
if you're like me and you're into cultures and languages and learning this kind of stuff, there's a great new app out there called Great Courses. And essentially it's top-end lecturers that really go into a lot of detail. It's not really documentary because there's usually like 20 or 30 episodes, but you're being lectured to. And there's some images that they show you, but it's really a lot more information and a lot less drama of a documentary. It's really like being, in a semester's class with these really high-end people who really know their stuff and know how to deliver it in a way that is enjoyable. I spend money. That's one of my streaming services is this one because I'm insane.
I wouldn't say that.
You
So I want to take us back for a second, though, because that started with taking inventory of what you have in your mind, like what you started with, like whatever you're working on, whether it be a tabletop game, a novel, or what have you. Whatever is your bare bones initial idea, like I want to tell a story about a knight in shining armor. I have a small culture that he lives in, and of course there's a conflict, so there's an enemy, and that's about all you got.
Yep.
Write all that down. Have an idea of what they're like, and start building there. So, what would be the next step from taking your initial inventory and asking questions about that initial stuff?
Another important question to ask yourself are how many races exist in your world. Don't feel the need that you need to have all of the token races or a unique
token or Tolkien.
Yes, that needs to become a quote on the website.
I love that joke.
What you need to do is take figure out what you want to do with races. If you don't want to play a lot with the sort of racial discussion in your world, you're probably going to have one, maybe two. And I'm not talking about races the way we classify them on Earth, where it's like, well, there's human, but then there's blacks and Asians and those different.
You're talking like
elves,
humanoid. Yeah. Well, it's funny because
not necessarily even humanoid.
Well, you know what I mean. I'm using that as a generic term. Sentient being, would you prefer that?
Sentient being.
Okay.
Yes.
Because there's also the argument, there's lots of stories where there are sentient beings that certain sentient beings are not aware of or recognize that other things are actually sentient.
Yes.
That's common.
And that's a good one. I like that one.
We were talking about this not too long ago, my wife and I, Sarah and I, and I was taking mental note and then verbal note of all the races that are in Game of Thrones. Because generally it's a human story. But if you start paying attention, you have that they show the giants. So okay, there were giants, and then
humans, obviously
humans, so and then not until like I don't know, it was the 4th or 5th season, you see what they call the children of the forest. So that's elves, what we would call elves,
or spirits, maybe. Who knows exactly?
They're corporeal, like they're well within the bounds of being corporeal because they die.
Sure.
The White Walkers are created.
Yeah, and you be careful with that one because there's the undead, but those aren't the White Walkers.
I'm not talking the undead. I'm talking the White Walkers. And then you could argue that wargs are their own thing. Or you could say that, well, they're just special powered humans or whatever, they may be. I feel there's another. Well, of course, there's dragons. Yeah. So you've got dragons, you've got giants, you've got elves.
I'm not sure if dragons are arguably sentient in the.
But my point is, the world, with the rules that he has established, he hasn't limited himself.
No, he's not.
Like the possibilities of other things being beyond Westeros that we're not aware of.
Yep.
Like when Arya says something like, what's west of Westeros, and so I wonder if within the context of his world, there are a bunch of other races that we haven't discovered.
I know
yet.
the answer to that. And it's very ironic. It's Easteros, which no one was expecting that.
Yeah, right. I was going to say. But wouldn't that be east of Westeros, not west of Westeros?
It should be. That's why
it's
really
confusing. Gotcha.
That's right.
It's a small spherical planet. It's a tubular planet. It's not spherical. It's tubular, and it wraps right around. So east is
there's
west.
actually the international date lines between the two.
Yeah,
so it's
right.
technically as far east as you can go.
Exactly. So what Jeff was saying, obviously, do you have multiple races? Is this just a human story, or I encourage you to consider maybe just an orc story? Maybe the planet is only a different race, not a human race. Obviously, it makes it easy to relate as a reader to your fiction if it is human.
Yeah, the further you take it away from humanoid, the harder it is going to be to convince people that it's real and that it actually is relatable. And not everyone cares about that, I'm sure. So like I said, I believe there's an audience for everything, but I would imagine most people are like myself, and I believe Michael and our avatar Mike, which I've decided that's his name now because
it bothers
I keep
me.
talking to him. But the idea is when you have all of these races, like if you go I have an insane number of races in my world, which really makes no logical sense in a naturalistic world setting, because over time, like if you look at humanity, there were lots of branches, but they sort of blended in together with Homo sapiens, and it sort of grew out into one real race that was left behind. But I wanted a lot of races, and it's a fantasy world, so sometimes you have to make those calls, and I came up with some mythology behind it to have it make sense.
See, I think that it's perfectly acceptable to argue that you take a look forget about humans for a second and just take a look at the other animals living on Earth.
Sure.
There is such a dramatic variety. So why couldn't there be within the context? Just look at dogs. Dogs alone. There are so many different kinds of dogs. They look different sizes, different shapes. There's tons of different kinds of dogs.
Where I would question it would be when you get to the level of you start getting to Bronze Ages and Iron Ages, that they're all surviving and thriving in certain areas, but not in others. And I think you can, but you need to think that out a bit more than if it's just one race.
I'm not sure I follow your point there.
Because once again, the closer things are, the more likely they are to breed.
Okay. Well, what if they can't though? What if it's a sake of lots of
as population builds up? What happens when you have two distinct cultures next to each other?
Yeah, one eventually weeds out the other.
But like I said, I have mythology in my world of why at the point you're in the world there are a lot of races. And if you would watch it progress over time into the space age, a lot fewer races remain, and there's actual reasons for that too. There are certain races that it's mandated they have their children in their race, even if they decide to marry outside of their race. Because they're considered protected, because they're important towards the formation of the future of Gardul, and the people in charge of the world at that point mandate it. They're really nice people.
And I'm encouraging to definitely consider doing a non-human race, because I've read books that were non-human races. There's two books that I'm thinking of in particular where I realize that elves are similar enough to human that you're not
humans with pointy ears.
Basically. But the cultural difference that showed up in both of the books that I'm thinking of was significant, and it's just I found it refreshing because there was that different. I don't think either book actually ran into any humans. I don't think there was a human. Actually, I lied. There's at least one or two. One of the big enemies was human. And I say was, I don't mean he existed in the book. He was human. I mean, within the context of the fiction, he used to be human. He became...
He's an ex-human.
Yeah, he became something very different. Yeah, he became almost technological something or other, and then like a planeswalker. Like it was really wild. It's a good book though.
Yes. After I figure out how many races I want in my world, which if you're like me and you have an insane amount of content in your world you have to develop, there's a lot. It could be down to 1. Probably not 0. That would be harder to write.
Or very simple.
Or very simple. That's true. The end. Now,
this is a story about a barren planet.
This next one I like to think of too.
Ooh, you just gave me an idea. I just gave me an idea. Let's write a book that's just about the continental plates shifting.
Yes.
The continents have sentient thoughts.
They're at war.
Slowly, I'm going to bash into that other continent.
In 1,000,000 years, I'm going to swallow that continent.
But you know what? You could think about it that way because they have that kind of time.
Yeah.
So you'd have to speed it up for the sake of the storytelling. Like
Yes.
it would be drawn out, but you'd have to talk about it in a fashion like it's not like, this mountain crashed into that mountain and it was a violent and horrific, cataclysmic occurrence, but it took like 20,000 years.
Yes.
I like this idea. This could be something.
And that could be an interesting parody for stuff like Game of Thrones, where screw the people, we'll just have the continents at war with each other. But once
you're going down, Pangea.
I'm going to rip this apart. Okay. Now, the other thing I like to think about, and this is separate from religion because you might have a fully formed religion, but there might be ideas for gods, especially pagan style gods. Maybe you have a god sort of like God on earth, like a one god. Do you have any gods that are in your mind, even if there isn't really religion formed around them, but you want these vastly superior beings who affect the planet? Or even if they don't affect the planet, but you know that some culture is going to worship God Blaziel. Blaziel would need to be written down at this point because you're taking inventory. Even though you don't have a full religion around him yet, you don't even necessarily know what culture or what race worships this god.
Maybe like Jeff in this moment, you just came up with a cool name and decided it would be a god. That's enough. That's a good starting point.
That is a good starting point. And for this, you don't even necessarily need the 3 descriptors at this point, unless you have them. If you have them, put them down, add some description so you keep the flavor of the god. And for gods, I always like to add in a caveat of, do they affect the world or not? And it might be a world rule like you came up with in the last episode where they can or cannot, or maybe they don't even really exist. That's all up to you. But on an individual basis, some might be able to and some might not be able to affect the world directly. And if they do at some point, you have to flesh out how and why and where they would do that. Okay, the next thing I like to think about when I go over all of this stuff at the beginning is when your story is going to take place, whether it's role-playing or a book or whatever, what tech level do you want it to be at? Because remember, when I talk about world building, it's from the lens of a framework, naturalistic world. So I need to know my endpoint I have to get to when I develop the cultures. It might be early. It could be maybe space age. Wherever you want to do that, the framework needs to sort of start from the Stone Age and kind of work its way up to where you're at. So you can sort of have a collision. It gives the world some basic history in the background, some conflicts that you know that might exist because of things that have happened over time. But you need to know technologically wise how far they're progressing into culture.
Yeah, and tech level is going to have such an impact on the world. Mm-hmm. The limitation on communication changes the world dramatically. Yeah. The limitation on transportation, like how things just move from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. So you having a good understanding of like not just, I want it to be swords and sorcery. So, it's Bronze Age. They can make, basic weapons, blah, blah, blah. But that's a really small part of it. Like I think transportation and communication are like the two biggest. Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll go over more of those when we actually get down into culture building.
Like not only, they have wagons, but do they have roads?
Can they teleport?
If they're just rocking wagons, they probably can't teleport yet.
But think about it, though. I mean, if they can, how dramatically does that change the way that a world evolves?
Yeah, agree. Are you talking like if a race has that as an ability, or if magically they have,
or everyone does in the world, or whatever,
just teleport?
It would radically change the face of a planet.
Absolutely.
Completely.
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think that. Well, I suppose that could lend to tech level.
Well, but
if it's technological,
it depends on how you do it.
My point is that not just in the stuff that when we think I'm going to make a fantasy world and I'm going to create a fantasy story, the first few things that come to mind for me are, fantastical races, combat, conflict, governmental hierarchy. So is it a monarchy? Or, is it, raiding parties? Like how is that structure going?
Yep.
And I don't immediately think of, well, what's farming like? How's everybody eating? What kind of transportation is there? But those things affect the world more.
Yeah.
Like that's what supports the other thing.
So when I talk about magic in my world, my magic evolves like a tech level where people get more sophisticated and can do more over time, which is good and bad, like technology. Once you develop that nuclear missile spell, you can't undevelop it.
Right.
But in my world, it develops very similar because people learn more. They learn different ways to manipulate it, and it changes over time. But even with that, 95% of the people who can actually use magic in my world use it for, guess what? Farming, transportation, shoring up defenses of cities. There's very few sort of what you think of as your classic spellcasters with fireballs and magic missiles flying across the room because quite frankly, the risk to reward is not as high.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to be putting yourself in combat situations all the time, of course you're going to become a wage mage and you're going to be throwing fireballs. But unless you're making it a point to go on those adventures, odds are you're going to be using more practical magic.
And really over time, the basis of my industry in the world is dominated by spellcasters. They figure out ways and new and different ways. So think of like corporations, the CEO having magic to enhance the way that they produce. It crushes out people who don't have that advantage. It helps grow bigger, larger, more monolithic organizations over time. And that's something I wanted. Doesn't really show up in my first stories. You start seeing the seeds of it starting to appear, though.
All right. So beyond tech level, is there anything else you wanted to cover on tech level?
Nope.
Just have an idea on tech level.
Because remember, this is really, we're coming up with the starting inventory, a place to start. And then once you do that, we'll start going over things very specifically. I'm not sure if we'll go over all of them. I have to go back to my other episodes to figure out if I need to cover Cosmos again and stuff like that. But definitely when it comes to religion, language, races, cultures, states, and faces, we will definitely be going over all of those again.
So what's the next question?
That's easy.
Jeff's trying to read his handwriting again. It cracks me up that you have almost as much difficulty reading your own handwriting as I do.
You know who reads it better than me?
Your wife.
Yes. Out of necessity, I guess she's learned the skill. For me, I can usually throw things away unless it's important.
You and my buddy Mike have some of the and you're both GMs, which is funny. You guys both have
we're like the doctors of gaming.
You are, the two of you. And you're both like insane world builders too. Like, I don't know if you know Mike's kind of an architect. Like the level of detail that he's gotten in making his world
Excellent.
is, like he wants to write a book as well.
Well, we should help him out.
He's got 3 kids.
Yeah, there's nothing like a coal mine to take care of those problems. Okay. So the next one, I like to look at what in the real world is inspiring you to world build. This is a little bit different than having predetermined races and cultures and stuff like that. But this is like saying maybe there's certain things from a culture you want to explore more.
Like an existing culture or one you've already created?
It's about from the real world. What are your real world inspirations that you want to affect your world? Maybe you want to do a non-Western fantasy because there's so much Western fantasy. Maybe you want to do South American or Australian or something that's inspired from a different region of the world. Any of those things that you want to do, this is where you kind of mark out. So later on, as you're developing, you can say, does this meet the inspirations? Maybe you don't use them all, but to me, I like to have a foundation of inspirations I'm working off of. And then later on, when I go into something more specifically, I'll link it to something like, okay, this one cultural trait I want to push towards these people. And once I do that, once I push it towards those people, I'll link it to that one. But I have this list of inspirations I want to use. And I've not used all of them, but a lot of them have been sort of connected with cultures. And that list of inspirations does grow over time. But as they sort of get linked to a culture or geography or something like that, some way it's actually inspiring my world, I actually sort of remove it from this list and I put it with that. So I know that when I want to develop this one thing more, I'm reminded of some of the inspirations for that culture, which is typically the main thing I like to do. And then one final thing is come up with a summary for your world. But once again, in those 3 bullet points, can you summarize the overall mood, what you want to use your world for? Come up with 3 bullet points to describe that. Because once again, as you're developing stuff, you can know that you're on track to make something useful for the world that you're making if you know the basics of what you want to achieve through the world, what types of stories you want to tell. Where I'm a culture heavy, you might not be culture heavy at all.
I want to expound on something that you just said that I think is really, really important, but it didn't used to be to me. When I was younger, when I was doing initial tabletop, the idea of it having a point never really dawned on me. The idea of creating an adventure and having fun and it being entertaining was where I was coming from. It like I want to go on an adventure. I want to.
That could be a bullet point for your world,
and I think that that's an important one since this is just fiction. But the idea of it having a point, having the GM or the novelist having a mission statement for an adventure, I think is really a great idea. I think it's a smart way to approach fiction. I think it's going to make the fiction more approachable and more affecting, as opposed to just here's this great fantasy, here's this fun adventure. If it's a game, here's this fun, adventure that I've written for you that's going to take you on this journey and you're going to experience things. But if in the background, I as the GM have a mission statement, something that I really want to impart on the player, or if you're a novelist, the reader, I just think that that's a really, really important thing to include in the foundation of your creative process. And it's something that I never would have thought of when I was younger. When I was younger, it was just create a cool world, have some really neat enemies, have cool motivations for them. But there was never the reason I want people to play, or the thing that I want people to get out of playing this world is this. I want them to either think about being a better human being, or I want them to consider, cultures that are being exploited in the United States, or, some sort of geopolitical message or what have you. Like, I think that lends itself to creating a thicker, more, robust fiction than just making something entertaining.
Because it helps you, find the types of conflicts that you want to have in your stories. The thing to keep in mind too is if you have a point to it, you can become preachy, and I think that is negative. But the basic conflicts, if they erupt around, like in my world, they'll erupt around different class structures. They'll erupt around cultures colliding. There's a couple different reasons why conflicts will rise up in my world. And there are other reasons too. But if I'm introducing a big villain, if I'm introducing someone, it's going to be about certain types of arguments that I want to make. And I don't like to go into that completely because part of it is I as I release stuff, I want to see what people's opinions are on that, because they always try and come up with, oh, this is left wing or right wing, or sometimes they'll argue, like for Hunger Games, both sides were like, oh, this is supporting our beliefs. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Really only the author knows. And I'm sort of against academia here, who believes authors don't know why they're doing things. And some might not, and there might be some subconscious stuff going on that they don't realize. But in general, why you're doing things. But that's really it. And if you take the last episode here and this episode, and you go back and you go through all of the questions I asked, thinking about the places, the cosmos and the world, the religions, the languages, the races, the culture, the states, the faces, and the technology level, how far you need to progress to get to your story, essentially you have an inventory of things that you need to get done. How do you tie them together? What kind of geography do you need to support the kinds of cultures you want? Maybe you don't care so much about cultures. Maybe for you, it's a little too deep and you want to think of cultures like states directly. sort of skip up to that level and push cultures and states into one, but know you're getting to so you can develop what you need robustly around your story and have lighter information going away as you develop your world. That way you can have more to it. So it keeps your mind fresh. So when you need the next story, maybe you can step them out a little further into a different part of the world, or maybe that part of the world comes to them and then you start developing that at that point. And then you make sure that it's developed always around where your stories are happening. So if you need to reach out into something else and bring it in, you have a consistent idea of what exists just beyond where you are at in the novel.
That's a lot of good points. As we're approaching NaNoWriMo, I know we're going to have more NaNoWriMo stuff, but I think there's one thing that we want to keep in mind, because a lot of what we've been talking about lately has really got my mind on gaming, and I'm sure there's a lot of GMs out there, and I don't want to neglect them as we get through NaNoWriMo, because I'm sure that there's a lot of people listening to this that are not writing novels. So,
but they should be. That's the point of NaNoWriMo.
I know.
Because once again, remember, you can use that content to develop stories to deliver to gamers as well. It doesn't need to end up being a novel that you publish to the world, in my mind, but it's a huge story that you can get out there, and then you could take subplots from it or try and see what happens if you give the players the same conditions as the story to see how it works out.
My point for mentioning it is I want to make it a point between now and the end of November to have some specific GM-targeted, game-topicked episodes.
Well, to me, this is a gamer-topic episode.
I know, but I'm thinking aloud here. Just an idea that
brainstorm them out.
Came to mind.
We'll fit them in.
Thanks for the eye roll.
Yeah, whatever you want, Michael.
Before we close it down, I'd be remiss if we didn't mention that if you want to help out the show, it'd be great if you guys went to www.gardul.com/Amazon for all of your Amazon needs. Keep it in the back of your mind and in the forefront of your mind at all times that Jeff's forthcoming novel is called The Steward's Son, and it'll be out next year. And of course, we'll be, hitting all kinds of points on that the closer and closer we get. And please share the show with some friends.
Yeah.
Like,
take two people who are game masters or authors who like genre fiction.
Or just people that would love the sultry sounds of my and Jeff's voice.
Which is, I think, all of humanity.
Yeah. Really, we just have to get voices out there. That's the only reason, that's the big reason we do the show, because the world deserves our voices. So
it's getting just what it deserves.
Scores one up.
All right. So now for the world building task of the day. Can you guess what the world building task of the day is going to be?
I'm going to guess that it's going to be take inventory.
Yes. You got it right.
Stab in the dark.
Yeah. So take the last two episodes together in its entirety. Put together a starting inventory for creating. And if you have a world in place, a lot of it's easy because you already have those cultures. You already have those races. But try and have it in one spot so you can come back and refer to it. And you can see, what else do I need to do? That's the bigger point of this, is to sit there and go, okay, this is what I have. Here are ideas I have to expand it. And you can keep track of it on it. It might take a couple sheets or 1,000 if you're like me and have like a lot of cultures. But, it gives you a centralized place to go to. So when you have time to world build, you can get going and go, oh, this one sounds interesting. Let me work on this now.
Yeah, and go back to
I need to work on this one.
And go back to the Kaizen board episode for organizational tips on doing that.
The real world task of the day. Go ahead. You seem pumped.
I am pumped, actually. So it's something that I've learned over my vast years on this world, because I'm now out of my 30s, Jeff. It's official. I am now middle-aged. I turned 40 the other day.
Actually, you're kind of safe there, because I define young as anyone my age or younger. So I'll
always be young.
You'll always be young.
Forever young.
Forever young.
What I was going to say is, one of the things that I've learned along the way is that a focused hour can be astoundingly productive. So I want you to try to take a focused hour to be real world life productive. I'm actually going to do more than that today. I'm going to do multiple hours. I'm going to do one, take a break, do one, take a break. I've got a few projects around the house I'm going to take on. So with coming to the end of the summer, pick some of the projects around the house that you've been neglecting and take care of them. In my house, it happens to be some shelving, and I'm going to build some boards around the base of the bed so the cats can't crawl into the bed and hide anymore. So pick some stuff around the house and just realize that you can get a ton done if you just ignore all of the distractions, put the cell phone away, and just focus on that one task.
Have we ever talked about Pomodoros on the show before?
Pomodoros? No. I'm sorry. Is that a name, Paul Madoros?
No. It's one word.
It's a thing. That's what I thought it was. I was going to say, what? I have no idea what that is.
It is a time management technique, and I don't want to go into it now. I'm going to link an episode from my other podcast, Small Biz Life. I'm pretty sure we did one specifically on time management, but that's one of the techniques in there. And I'll give you more, but the basic gist is break down your time into an hour block, or if you hate doing what you're doing, like a 30-minute block. So it's like 25 minutes work, focused one thing only. When you get through that 25 minutes, you take a 5-minute break.
Yeah.
After an hour, you take a 10-minute break. And in those breaks, you want to do something kind of physical to get your blood flowing again. But when you're focused on productivity during your working, you have one thing up. All of your notifications are off. All your Facebooks are closed. It's all shut down. You're focused on one topic at a time. Especially if you have limited time, I get so much more done using this during the week when I get home after work. You need to support the people around you, but I'll link the episode for more information. But that's a good technique that I think is very useful in this scenario.
So go get some focused productivity done.
And if you need to do housework, come on over.
And as always, make sure to go to Gardul.com. That's Gardul.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.